Israel and Hamas are now nearly a day into an as-yet unbroken ceasefire, and that began at 8 a.m. local time. Israel pulled its tanks and troops from the Gaza Strip as Prime Minister Netanyahu announced a successful end to Israeli Defense Forces operations. But the real test of the Egyptian-brokered 72-hour ceasefire agreement, assuming it holds, will come if efforts to negotiate a more permanent truce are also successful. That may prove to be more challenging as Hamas and Israeli delegations are negotiating in Cairo. Here to help us understand the actors and their demands is Jonathan Schanzer, Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and author of State of Failure. He joins us now for Q&A. Jonathan, good to see you.
Thanks, Buck.
Tell us, how was this ceasefire brokered exactly? This was in Cairo. Who were the actors, and what were some of the demands that were pushed back and forth to at least get us to a point now where the shooting has stopped?
Sure. Well, when this war started, it became very clear that there were really two camps. The Muslim Brotherhood camp, let's call it, that's Qatar and Turkey on the one hand, versus those who actually had to live alongside Hamas, and that is, of course, Egypt and Israel. The Turks and the Qataris made it pretty clear early on that what they wanted was nothing short of a great deal for Hamas, one that would allow, for example, for an airport, for a seaport, for unfettered access across the Rafah border, and for integration into the global economy, if you will. The Egyptians and the Israelis, having already had their experiences with Hamas, were not interested in any of the above. And so that, I think, in large part explains why a ceasefire was so elusive for 3+ weeks. It was only when the Israelis determined that they were ready to pull back entirely and that they were going to do so unilaterally out of Gaza, and that it would not be done through negotiations, but rather based on their military needs. It was, I think, at that point that the Qataris and the Turks realized that they had lost all the leverage that they believed that they had.
Jonathan, can I ask you a question about, in your piece, you refer to Qatar and Turkey as BFFs of Hamas, best friends forever. Why is Turkey and why is Qatar, why are these two countries so interested in being helpful and giving so much assistance to Hamas when other Arab states in the region are basically saying Hamas has got to cut this stuff out?
Well, these were the two countries that bet heavily on the Arab Spring. They thought that the Brotherhood was going to take over in Egypt, take over in Tunisia, take over in Syria. They've lost. This is their last remaining bet. This is sort of their Alamo, if you will. And they are doing everything that they can to ensure that Hamas survives this. But I have to say, as U.S. allies, they, I think, are really, they're getting pretty dirty doing this. They don't look very good. And I think it really has exposed them as terrorist patrons. And it'll be interesting to see how they survive this once the ceasefire takes hold.
I mentioned your piece in Foreign Policy where you talked about how these two countries, Turkey and Qatar, should be considered on the side of Hamas. Former President Jimmy Carter also has a piece in Foreign Policy, and in it he calls for the political recognition of Hamas. Essentially, Hamas needs to be talked to. He writes that the United States and EU should recognize that Hamas is not just a military but also a political force. Hamas cannot be wished away, nor will it cooperate in its own demise. Only by recognizing its legitimacy as a political actor, one that represents a substantial portion of the Palestinian people, can the West begin to provide the right incentives for Hamas to put down its weapons. How would you respond to former President Carter saying essentially Israel just needs to learn to live with Hamas?
Well, look, I think what's implied in that piece is that Hamas is a legitimate government. But if it was a legitimate government, why did it take $1.5 billion worth of assistance from the international community and plow it into tunnels that snaked into Israel, 32 of them with one goal in mind, commando attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers? This is not a responsible government. This is a terrorist organization that happens to control a territory, and it should not be granted that kind of legitimacy.
All right, Jonathan, good to see you. Thank you for sharing your expertise.